So we discussed how Jupiter caused the first nuclear crisis through its fast response time and its high accuracy. But let's talk about how crisis number 2 came around, how IRBMs returned to Europe the second time. So in the 1970s, there was this thing known as détente, where the Soviets and the United States kind of realized that they didn't actually want to exterminate each other, and they in fact could get along. Remarkable. And so there was a brief period in the early 1970s where we were shaking hands and kissing babies in space, more or less, minus the baby part. But the problem was the Soviets had a military-industrial complex to feed, and they needed to keep building missiles. So the SALT II treaty forbid them from increasing their fleet of ICBMs, but it had nothing to say about IRBMs. So why not, right? So they took their road mobile ICBM, pulled the third stage off, and made it a 2-stage IRBM, the RSD-10 Pioneer, the SS-20 Saber. Now this missile got a lot of attention in the West, and they were quite concerned about this new capability because unlike the silo-based R-12s and R-14s, these were mobile. These weren't able to be located on a constant basis. Further still, they were much higher performance missiles, and in fact were eventually equipped with a triple warhead MIRV, something that the United States never ever managed to do in a mobile missile. So these things were very concerning. And this resulted in NATO being very concerned about U.S. commitments to protecting Europe. We go back to this issue of Europeans being concerned about their own security. If the United States is given the ability to abandon Europe, will they choose to do so? So the Europeans want Americans in Europe that are themselves able to threaten the Soviets and deter a first strike by these RSD-10 Pioneer fleet. So what Jimmy Carter and his people end up thinking up is the dual track decision. And this dual track essentially offers two hands. A right hand to shake the hand of the Soviets saying that, hey man, we're here to deal if you choose to do so. But they made sure to recognize that there was a hand behind the back. And so this was a dual track decision. There was two choices that the Soviets were going to be allowed to make. Choice number one, which was to get rid of these RSD-10s, which were of such concern, or the United States was going to deploy its own version and scare the Soviets into taking the first option. And that's precisely where this guy came from, the Pershing II. So this dual track decision is put down in front of the Soviets, and they refuse to take the first choice. They're saying, you Americans are not capable of producing such concerning systems. And they were incorrect. So the US goes ahead and deploys these. So Pershing II has a range slightly below that of Jupiter, but it's enough to hit certain parts of the USSR from Germany, parts of Ukraine, for instance. But the Soviets misunderstood. They thought this had enough range to hit Moscow from Germany. So here they assumed a new threat, identical to that presented by Jupiter, had presented itself, right? A very fast reaction time, very high accuracy, and a new problem, tactical stealth. So let's get those individually, how they're an even greater threat than Jupiter. So as far as reaction time, this guy is not a cryogenically powered ballistic missile. This is a solid fuel missile. And not only that, it's a very snappy solid fuel missile as far as how quickly it's able to get into action. It's able to go from a state of readiness like this to firing position within, seconds. And so this allowed for an even higher reaction time than what Jupiter was able to do. And the accuracy was much higher too, where Jupiter had a, for the time, incredibly advanced inertial navigation system. This had its own cutting-edge guidance system. Inside of that white cap is a parabolic antenna. And that antenna is attached to a computer, and together they form this remarkable device known as a radar. And as this vehicle sailed through the atmosphere, it was able to use those fins on the reentry vehicle to orient it so that it's facing down towards the Earth, and it's able to look at the Earth and take a picture and compare that picture to stored images of its target. So this was able to correct itself. So imagine, for instance, with an inertial navigation system, you're essentially navigating with your eyes closed by counting your steps, right? You're not able to see the target, but you're able to know where you started and how many steps it takes to get to your target, right? But you're going to miscount. You're not going to step a full length. Eventually, there's going to be drift, and there's no way of knowing without any observation of the outside world. With a radar, that goes away. So it's essentially the difference between walking around with your eyes closed, counting steps, and walking with your eyes open, trying to compare pictures, right? So a much, much more accurate system. So faster response time because of solid fuel and advanced launch systems, and a greater accuracy due to a terminal radar guidance system, right? But there was a third problem now represented by Pershing, which was tactical stealth. So Jupiter was not a mobile system. It was built in fixed positions and had a very large infrastructure around it to support the very complex fueling system of cryogenically cooled liquid oxygen and kerosene, whereas this guy needed none of that. All you needed was a truck, right? So where a Jupiter battery had, 20 vehicles, this had 2, or maybe 3, necessary to launch a single missile. And so because of this, once there was concern about a military conflict, these guys could leave their bases and disappear into the German countryside, never to be found again until they returned home. But in the event of the Soviets attempting a first strike, they would be unable to locate these things, and thus unable to prevent them from shooting back at the Soviet Union. So this is very concerning to the Soviets because in their mind they saw a system that was able to hit Moscow from Germany very quickly, more quickly than any weapon system available to anybody at this point in time, and it could disappear into the woods and would not be able to be found, right? So this is a terrifying system. And the terror of this system leads to the Abel Archer crisis of 1983. Now there's a lot of argument about whether this crisis even happened, so I'm not going to get into the historiography of it too much. So we're going to assume that it went as the common understanding is that the Soviets thought that we were going to shoot them first. Abel Archer was a nuclear weapons release exercise by the United States, so essentially it was trying to simulate a realistic situation where a nuclear weapon was being fired at the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, being very good spies, were aware of this and weren't quite sure if this was practice or not. Now, luckily, cooler heads prevailed just as they did back in 1962. So this time around, we didn't have JFK and Khrushchev. We instead had Ronald Reagan and Yuri Andropov. Now, Ronald Reagan was a little bit of a dealer, but Yuri Andropov was not. Now, luckily, Andropov didn't stick around for too long and was replaced fairly quickly by Gorbachev. And Gorby wanted peace. He saw the economic issues that the Soviets were falling into and recognized that if they didn't do something, they were going to be doomed, right? So Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan get together and they say, listen, these IRBMs and stuff are pretty concerning. They're destabilizing, right? And if we want to have a continued peace between the US and the USSR, which we do, we should get rid of these weapons, right? And they both agreed. Remarkable. And this led to the INF Treaty. So the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, bans any nuclear weapon with a range, or rather any weapon, even conventional, with a range between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. So this allows for shorter range tactical systems to be retained, and also longer range strategic systems to be retained, like ICBMs, but gets rid of this kind of middle class of destabilizing intermediate range weapons. Because remember, like we were saying with Jupiter and with Pershing, what makes these weapons so destabilizing is they are the ultimate quick draw weapon, right? A very high response time or very short response time relative to other weapons, and also very high accuracy due to their shorter range and novel guidance methods in this case. So they agreed to get rid of this whole class of weapon, and that is precisely what they did. So beginning in 1988 with the ratification of the treaty, the Soviets and the United States began taking these INF class weapons and destroying them. They would burn out the motors in a static firing, and then they would crush the rocket bodies, so that by the end of 1991, there were no more Pershing IIs in existence besides those like this one, which had been demilitarized for museum purposes. An entire class of weapon had been wiped out for the first time in human history. Like, chemical weapons were made illegal, but they weren't destroyed. But this class of weapon was so concerning that it was made illegal in its entirety. And the Soviet fleet of RSD-10 Pioneers was wiped out along with the legacy fleets of R-12s and R-14s. And the United States got rid of its arsenal of Pershing IIs, Pershing Is, and ground-launched cruise missiles. And this began a cascading effect starting in 1987 and 88 that led to 89, where the fall of the Berlin Wall occurred, and then in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So think about this. In June of 1991, the destruction of the INF weapons is complete. And then by December of that same year, the Soviet Union collapses. And that's because it has been allowed to. Its economic problems have been allowed to come to fruition without the sort of war scare taking place that was driven by these IRBMs, right? So the INF Treaty allowed the Cold War to end. And there's other things that were essential to this, such as the SALT II and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There's lots of elements. It's very dynamic. But if I had to point to a single treaty that more than any other resulted in the peace between the USSR and US, it is the INF Treaty that got rid of these things. So why did we tear it up? This little video has gone on longer than I expected it to, so we're going to skip the third crisis and get to that in a second video. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I certainly enjoyed making it. This place is really quite wonderful. If you ever find yourself out in Cape Canaveral, find yourself a museum tour and get out to Hangar C if you can. Hopefully you understand the history of these systems a little bit better and understand how they influence international politics and, most importantly, influence international politics today. So intermediate range weapons are returning to Europe, and we're going to cover all of these in this second video, so stick around for that. And this has a lot to do with China, a lot to do with Putin, a lot of different things. And I hope you guys want to see it. And if you do, there's a little subscribe button down there. You can click on that and I'll let you know when it's ready. Besides that, just once again, thanks for watching. Until next time, it's been Tim Buckland, your host, and you guys take care of yourselves.